And welcome to Long Live the Queen, where we talk about the women who made history. And by we, I mean the royal we, because it's just me. Today we're going to talk about Joan of Burgundy. Joan of Burgundy was born in the year of our Lord, 1293. The Duchy of Burgundy, if you listened before this, is what I've been calling French Burgundy. Her father was Robert II, Duke of Burgundy. He was a high-ranking vassal lord of the King of France. Her mother was Princess Agnes of France, daughter of Louis IX, Saint Louis. We have spoken about Joan's grandmother. Joan's maternal grandmother was Margaret of Provence, who has her own episode. Her mother, Agnes, doesn't have an episode. I'm sorry, Agnes' episode would be very short. Agnes was the youngest daughter of a king. Then she married the Duke of Burgundy and had 8 children. That's about all I know. But her 4th child was Joan, and that is where we are now, in the Duchy of Burgundy, 1293. Joan had a limp, and one shoulder was higher than the other, earning her the less than amazing moniker, Joan the Lame. Women don't get monikers often, so lame when it turns out to be lame. When Joan was about 12 years old, her older sister Margaret was marrying their cousin. Well, their first cousin once removed. But he was the King of Navarre and the future King of France, so sometimes you marry your cousin the king, I guess. The next year, in 1306, when Joan was about 13 years old, her father died. We don't know what he died of, but he was 57 or 58 years old at the time. Joan's brother, Hugh, became the new Duke of Burgundy, and just a year after her father's death, her other sister was getting married to a member of the old House of Savoy. Probably not her cousin. Good for her. It wasn't Joan's turn to get married for another 6 years when Joan was about 20. Another first cousin once removed. The bride's great-grandfather was the groom's grandfather. Joan of Burgundy was marrying, at 20, the 20-year-old Philip of Valois. He was the second prince of the blood after his own father. If his cousins faltered with male heirs, the Valois were the next ones up for the job. The oldest of these cousins was married to Joan's older sister Margaret. And Joan's sister Margaret was not in a happy marriage. The couple had one daughter named Jeanette, but no boys yet on the horizon. When Joan was about 21, bad news from her sister's camp. Allegations had been made. Her sister was married to the heir to the throne of France, but his sister had claimed that she had circumstantial evidence that Joan's sister Margaret had been having an affair with a cute Norman knight, Gautier d'Aunay. The king had investigated his daughter-in-laws and found 2 of them guilty. Margaret, Joan's sister, and her sister-in-law Blanche had been convicted. Their heads were shaved, and they were put in prison. Most accounts say an underground dungeon-style prison, but I also have heard high up in a tower prison. But either way, it was a cold, harsh environment. Joan's brother-in-law wanted an annulment, but the Pope had died, and the new Pope hadn't been selected yet, so they were out of luck. It was around now that the king died, leaving Joan's sister the imprisoned Queen of France. The king is dead, long live the king. The new king was Joan's brother-in-law, King Louis X, the quarrelsome one. After just about a year in prison, Joan's sister died, either from the cold, harsh conditions or from strangulation, murder, so her husband could remarry. And he did remarry immediately, so that was sus. After being king for just a year and a half, Joan's former brother-in-law died, leaving behind a pregnant wife. She had her baby, and it was a boy that lived only 5 days, King John the Posthumous. The royal family was down to just 2 male heirs before the Valois took control. The new king was the brother of the old king. The king is dead, long live the king, King Philip V. 5 years after her sister was accused and convicted, Joan, at the age of 26, was now having her first baby. That age is refreshing. On the 26th of April, 1319, Joan had her first baby, a little lord they named John. He became 3rd prince of the blood after his father and his grandfather, and there were just 2 Capetians standing between them and the throne of France. Joan didn't have more babies for a while. I'm not exactly sure why, but things did start to happen. When Joan's little boy was about 3 years old, King Philip V died. The king is dead, long live the king. The new king was the old king's last younger brother. King Charles IV. He was the pretty one. We don't have a lot of information about this time, because despite being so close to the throne now, they were still lesser royals, the junior members of the royal family. In 1325, when Joan was about 32, her father-in-law, the first Prince of the Blood, died without ever having gained his brother's throne. This meant that Joan's husband was now the first Prince of the Blood, with only his one sonless cousin between him and the French throne. Joan's 6-year-old son was the second Prince of the Blood after his father, but the couple could really use a spare. The year following her father-in-law's death, Joan had a second baby at 33. Again, how refreshing. This baby was little Lady Marie, so not a spare, but a healthy girl. In 1327, at the age of 34, Joan's mother died, and she lost her only surviving parent. Just 3 months after the death of her mother, King Charles IV died with no sons, and the Capetians had faltered with male heirs. This meant moving on to the Princes of the Blood, and the first Prince of the Blood was Joan's husband. Joan, at the age of 36, was the new Queen of France. Her 9-year-old son, Lord John, was now Dauphin of France, heir to the throne after his father, and her daughter, Lady Marie, was now 3-year-old Princess Marie. Joan needed a spare, but she was also 36 years old, and so it was going to be a little dangerous. Less than a year after becoming the new Queen of France, Marie had another baby at the age of 37. Prince Louis was born in January, but he died later that same day. His mother, Queen Joan, however, survived, no small feat, after having a baby at 37 in 1329. The next year, Queen Joan was expecting again. In June, she had another little boy, Prince Louis. His mother again survived, but little Prince Louis only lived to be 15 days old. Joan was pregnant again the following year at 40. She was definitely risking her life for a spare now, but the hold on the throne hinged on her only surviving son, John. It was at about this time that Joan's husband looked into marrying his 13-year-old son, Dauphin John. After a bit of a break at the age of 43, Queen Joan was pregnant again. When Queen Joan was about 9 months pregnant, her 7-year-old daughter Marie died. Just about 2 weeks after the death of her daughter, Queen Joan had and immediately lost another little prince. Her only surviving child was her 14-year-old son, Dauphin John. A year and a half later, 42-year-old Queen Joan was pregnant again. But until her son had his own son, that was her job. And her son was now just 16, but his wife was 19. In May, 42-year-old Queen Joan had a stillborn baby, another little prince. And just the following year, in 1336, 43-year-old Joan had another baby, and this one survived. Prince Philip was born. He became the spare of his 17-year-old brother. They had some breathing room, but not much. 17-year-old Dauphin John still didn't have any children of his own. And Queen Joan's pregnancies didn't seem to be slowing down. At her age, at this time, every pregnancy was more life-threatening than the next. At the age of 44, Queen Joan was pregnant again. In November 1337, 44-year-old Joan had a daughter. Princess Jeanette was born and died shortly after birth. The next year, 45-year-old Joan's daughter-in-law was expecting her first baby. Joan became a grandmother at the age of 45. Her 19-year-old son and his 23-year-old wife, Bona of Bohemia, had their first child. Prince Charles, new Dauphin of France, displacing his uncle, Joan's son, 2-year-old Prince Philip. I don't think that was really on the toddler Philip's radar, but it meant that Queen Joan at 45 could stop having children, and at 45 she was running out of time. The next year, Joan's daughter-in-law was pregnant again. She had her second son in 1339, Prince Louis, his brother's spare. Queen Joan's son, upon his father's death, would become the first Prince of the Blood, and that's how it worked. Joan's oldest son's family would be the new royal family, and her second son's family would be the new Princes of the Blood. The very next year, her oldest son welcomed his third child and third prince, Prince John, and 2 years later, they added Prince Philip. Okay, time out. If you listen to my episode on Isabella of Valois, you may remember that she was married at 6 years old. She was the one who had to be carried, crying to her wedding day by her great uncles, John and Philip. These two newest princes, John and Philip, will grow up to be those great uncles, because that first grandchild was the future grandfather of Isabella of Valois, the future Queen of England. If you follow that thread to the final conclusion, this episode on Joan of Burgundy, Queen of France, is not only the great-grandmother of both Queens of England, Isabella and Catherine of Valois, but that would also make her the great-great-grandmother of King Henry VI, the great-great-great-grandmother of King Henry VII, and you can follow that thread down to today's royal family. But back to Queen Joan. In 1343, 50-year-old Joan's daughter-in-law was pregnant again, but so was 50-year-old Joan. This likely would have been a surprise at 50. Joan hadn't had a baby for the last 4 years since she was 46. In the summer of 1343, Joan's daughter-in-law had her 5th child, a little girl named Joan, likely after her grandmother, and her grandmother also had a baby, a son who died not long after birth. But Queen Joan, at 50, had survived another birth. This would be Joan's last pregnancy. She had been pregnant at least 9 times, but had just 2 surviving sons, 24-year-old father of 5, Dauphin John, and 7-year-old Prince Philip. Joan's daughter-in-law had 2 more daughters, Marie and Isabella, born in 44 and 48 respectively. In 1348, the plague had arrived in France. It was new, and it was bad. The plague killed 1/3 of the population. One of the people killed was Joan's daughter-in-law, Bona of Bohemia. 2 months and a day after the death of Joan's daughter-in-law of the plague, Queen Joan also died of the plague. Her husband would remarry almost immediately, and it was a bit scandalous, but you'll have to come back for my next episode on Joan of Navarre for that tea. And that is where I'll leave it for now. What did you think of Joan of Burgundy? She wasn't meant to be the Queen of France until the Templars may have cursed the Capetians. But then she was, and she survived 9 births, her last one at the age of 50. And while that was amazing for the time, only 2 of her babies survived, and that's very sad. She spent her whole life trying to have more children. You can share your thoughts with me at longlivethequeenpodcast@gmail.com or on Facebook or Instagram at longlivethequeenpodcast. If you enjoyed this episode, leave a 5-star review or join me on Patreon for bonus content and extended episodes. Long live to all the queens out there, and until next time, bye.
You'll be remembered.
Thanks for listening.